The Dark Ages, an era of serial killer thugs called knights, Oxford-educated academic assassins, outlandish homicide rates, blood eagle-loving Vikings, half-starved peasants so mad they danced until they dropped dead. And who could forget the hairdressers, whose part-time gig was performing horrific amputations? It was a tough life back then, and we're sure you'll agree pretty soon. Let's start with medieval light entertainment. In 1194, on Shrove Tuesday in London, the peasants were out in large numbers for a game of soccer, what's now referred to as mob football. William Fitzstephen, a 12th century English monk, wrote about this game, played by the masses of the town, one giant team against another. His chronicle states Richard I had been crowned King of England for the second time. A great crowd of young Londoners gathered together to play ball. So far, so good. Sounds like fun. But as usual, the game got out of hand. William wrote, "The game began in the fields outside the city but soon moved to the streets and squares where it became more dangerous and violent. Many were injured and some killed in the tumult." He said the city authorities tried to stop it, but the young men were too numerous and too passionate to be easily restrained. Sport in the Dark Ages, also called the Middle Ages and medieval times, from the 5th century to the 15th century, could be a brutal affair. So the peasants loved a bit of soccer, very, very hardcore soccer. Sure, the elites liked to joust, and that was rough, but peasants kicking a ball about was far more chaotic. It was a battle as much as it was a fun pastime, and like many of the things you'll hear today, a fine example of just how tough it was to live through the Dark Ages. Just wait until you hear about what happened at Oxford. Your mind will be blown out of your head. To get back to our intense game of soccer, the peasants of the time would take an inflated pig's bladder, and the two teams, often the men of a whole village or town, would try to get the ball to the other side of the town. There weren't too many rules. The general agreement was you shouldn't kill anyone on the opposing team, although that happened just as William the Monk pointed out. Another chronicle from the 1200s talked about two men who died playing the game. One was smashed in the face with a stone, and the other apparently ran into a dagger. You might think running into a dagger was some shoddy detective work, but you'll understand later why this was nothing out of the ordinary. But it's one reason why kings in both England and France banned mob soccer. The mayor of London under King Edward II called it one of the many evils which God forbid. In 1363, King Edward III of England, evidently a killjoy, banned football, cockfighting, iron throwing, and other games he said were the predisposition of the idol. The king noted that these people's time would be much better spent practicing archery for the next war. Wartime back then was pretty much all the time. Life expectancy was about 30 years at the time, although it was better for the nobility than for the commoners. As the philosopher Thomas Hobbes said later in time, life for most people was poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People in the Dark Ages lived under what's called a feudal system. This was a hierarchy with the monarchy right at the top. Peasants were at the bottom, with nobles and lords in the middle. The nobility owned the land, which they could give to someone like a knight. Not all people who ran the lord's land, or fief, were knights. Some simply held the land, what were called vassals. They had an allegiance to support the lord, who in turn had an allegiance to the monarchy. Knights, on the other hand, could have been landless or have land granted to them. At the bottom of the pile, which was the majority of the people, 85 to 90%, were the peasants. A type of peasant was a serf. They owned diddly squat. They were tied to the land. Other peasants who worked some kind of trade were called freemen. They were free to move about. There were also different levels of serfdom. Some serfs could move from manor to manor. Serfs had very few legal rights or protections. They couldn't even get married without the lord's permission. They had to pay the lord for this right, something called a merchant. When the serf died, he had to pay, which meant the lord had a legal right to take everything the serf owned. This was called heriot. If that sounds unfair, it's because it was. In 1214, a chronicler described lords who took heriots as vultures that prey upon death, worms feeding upon the corpse. It's hard to imagine the emotional toll this unfair system would have taken on a serf's mental health. While options for coping with stress and anxiety were scarce in the 13th century, we're fortunate to have access to modern resources for our emotional well-being today. That's why we want to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service, and it's 100% online. With BetterHelp, you can tap into a network of over 30,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with a wide range of issues. To get started, you just answer a few questions about your needs and preferences in therapy. That way, BetterHelp can match you with the right therapist from their network. Then, you can talk to your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether it's via text, chat, phone, or video call. You can message your therapist at any time and schedule live sessions when it's convenient for you. If your therapist isn't the right fit for any reason, you can switch to a new therapist at no additional charge. With BetterHelp, you get the same professionalism and quality you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who is custom-picked for you, more scheduling flexibility, and at a more affordable price. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/infographics, and I've also linked them below in the description. Now back to those unfortunate serfs. Serfs also had to fix the Lord's house, plow for him, and go to war for him when required, which fell under the term boon work. To quote a movie, serfs were the most wretched, miserable, servile, pathetic trash ever pooped into humanity. But at least these people were given a chance to survive. They often didn't when the harvests were bad, but their existence was a damn sight better than being a slave. Slaves had no rights at all. They were bought and sold and unsurprisingly often treated badly. You know very well that the Romans kept slaves, but the slave trade in Europe went into overdrive after the Roman Empire. In England, the Angles and the Saxons traded slaves with each other and also with the Vikings when the Vikings weren't raiding villages or taking away all their children. We can't talk about the Dark Ages without giving the Vikings a bit of our video space. As you might have guessed from watching TV shows, the Scandinavian Vikings were a bit of a handful. In the 9th and 10th centuries, they wreaked havoc across Europe and beyond. But England was a hotspot of brutality before the Vikings settled there. In those centuries, they conducted over 200 raids on England, and they weren't ever nice raids. The people of the Kingdom of Northumbria experienced appalling levels of Viking violence. Still, everywhere they went, Dublin, Orkney, and the Shetlands off the coast of Scotland, East Anglia, and more, the Vikings gave no quarter to the locals. In 866, according to one chronicle, the Danes made great slaughter at York. York had been an important Roman settlement, but after the empire fell, the Anglo-Saxons took over, as they did all over England. It was an important place, which is why Ivar the Boneless, and a top commander of the so-called Great Heathen Army, Ubba, didn't show any mercy upon their arrival there. The Norse poem Krakhumal also said that the Vikings wanted revenge after the Anglo-Saxons had put the Danish king and superhero in Norse mythology, Ragnar Lodbrok, in a snake pit. Ivar and Ubba literally weren't taking any prisoners when they arrived in York. The sagas state they did the worst thing possible to the King Ela of Northumbria. The Old English text says they slaughtered everyone, men, women, and children. They then asked for a tribute, which they said would make them ease off on the mass killing, but even when they got their payment, they kept on with the slaughter. As for King Ela, the sagas state he was given the dreaded blood eagle. The poem states they caused the bloody eagle to be carved on the back of Ela, and they cut away all of the ribs from the spine, and then they ripped out his lungs. You can only imagine what those local folks in places like Bridlington in Yorkshire felt when they saw Viking ships in the distance. But the Vikings weren't all about barbarity. They created Dane law in England, a legal system that espoused the importance of community and family relationships. Sure, the Vikings were fearless and at times brutal, but they weren't always heartless. Everyone back then, to some extent, had to be ruthless from time to time. The Anglo-Saxons massacred the Danes too. In 1004, they did that in a part of England, and the records showed that they thought the Danes deserved it. Part of the text read, the Danes who had sprung up on the island, sprouting like a cockle amongst the wheat, were to be destroyed by a most just extermination. You don't see anyone talking about just war crimes today. All over England, the Anglo-Saxons did this to the Vikings. Archaeological sites show that they attacked unarmed people and then chopped off their heads. Violent xenophobia was the norm back then. The Vikings landed in North America, Russia, France, Iceland, and Greenland, usually surprising the local communities and not sparing those who fought back. But they didn't always slaughter the women and children. They had a particular fondness for pillaging and plundering churches. Holy men weren't exactly good at defending themselves, and there were often valuables in the church or at the monasteries. In other places, they just demanded a tribute to be paid forth, or else. After 200 years of this, parts of the British Isles were full of these Viking folk and their offspring. Their laws and their language played an important part in the formation of Britain. But the people that changed everything were the Normans, who had been Vikings themselves as they settled in northern France. It was the Normans that wrote in the Domesday Book that says in 1086 about 10% of the people in England were slaves, English slaves. This was why life was so brutal back then for the average person without much power or protection. In the 12th century, Scottish and Welsh raiders also would snatch up people and take them as slaves. Now you can see why serfs put up with what they did. At this point in time, there were slave markets all over Europe, just as there were for centuries to come. There was a thriving trade in selling slaves from Bristol in England and then sending them over to Ireland's huge slave markets. This was not indentured servitude, it was full-blown slavery. In the late Dark Ages, North Africa's pirates, called the Barbary and Corsair pirates, also became well known for their raids across most of Europe. They raided the coastlines of England, France, Spain, Italy, and elsewhere, taking between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans as slaves. Although most of the raiding was just after the Dark Ages, still, North African pirates raided Europe's coastlines from at least the 7th century to the 19th century. It's impossible to know just how many slaves they took in all that time, or even how many they captured during the Dark Ages, but the answer is a hell of a lot. Slavery was a big deal in Europe, although England and Wales could breathe a sigh of relief when the Normans banned the trade inside England in the 12th century. That didn't stop the trade, but it did calm down. You might think serfdom sounds like slavery, but it wasn't the same, at least not exactly. Serfs couldn't be bought or sold, but if the land was sold to another lord, then the serfs were automatically part of the bargain. This made a large population of peasants all but slaves in nature but not in name. As you'll see, they knew that and would occasionally fight back against the nobles to get themselves more rights. For one thing, they were sick of starving to death. Their diet was terrible most of the time. They usually had bread, not the bread we're used to today, but a dark bread made from rye or barley. Wheat bread was seen as a luxury, as was meat, which they might only eat on holidays. It depended on their level of serfdom. What's more, the bread was sometimes contaminated with a fungus which could cause scary hallucinations or even lead to death, which brings us to a very interesting feature of the Dark Ages. In the 1300s, there were reports all over Europe of masses of people just starting to dance. Others joined in, some of them dancing until they literally dropped dead. We now call this mass hysteria or mass psychogenic illness, or at least that's one theory. Maybe the devil did it. There were epidemics in France and England which became known as dancing manias. People wouldn't just strut their stuff, they'd often shout vulgar words and take off their clothes, thousands of them at a time, laughing and crying to the point of exhaustion and death. Others made love in the streets like animals. Many broke their limbs. This could have been purely psychological, but it might have been a nervous system issue, or maybe it was that trippy bread. Spider bites were also blamed at times, but why did newcomers see the dancing and join in, then act as crazy as the crowd? That couldn't be blamed on spiders or nervous systems. There was an outbreak in 1278 in France with 200 dancers, men, women, and children. They danced so hard on a bridge over the River Meuse that it collapsed. England, Germany, and the Netherlands all saw outbreaks of dancing plagues, with demonic possession often being said to be the cause. The fact is, when life is that hard, you can understand madness being contagious. Those poor peasants suffered levels of stress we can't even imagine, and they didn't have yoga or Xanax. Back to their diet, the staple for a peasant was porridge, a kind of gruel made from oats, barley, and millet. If they had cows or goats, they got goat milk, cheese, and butter, and if the Lord allowed it, they got to fish. One thing most peasants enjoyed was ale made from fermented grain, which was often safer than drinking water. From 1300 to 1500, per capita consumption of ale was 275 to 300 liters a year. But ale consumption goes back to the start of the Dark Ages. In 822, it's written that a monk got the idea to put hops in beer. Booze changed Europe, which, as you'll soon see, had some very negative consequences. Men drank more than women, while the man usually did most of the physical work, the women did the lighter work. There were usually more men around than women due to the fact that so many women died during childbirth. Even if the baby survived, it had only a 50% chance of making it to the age of 1. If the child got past this tricky stage of life, the woman would take care of it. By the time the child was 12, he or she should be working. There was no education for these peasants' kids other than what the mother passed on during early youth. Nearly all peasants were illiterate. The English nobles did learn to read and write. The written language was Latin or Old English, but depending on where you were, other languages were spoken, including Old English, Cornish, Gaelic, Pictish, and Welsh. After the Normans invaded, French was spoken all over England for maybe 2 centuries, but mostly by the nobles who saw Old English as the language of the dull-witted. Still, the nobles were no less vulgar when it came to their actions. As you know, actions speak louder than words. The nobles could not stop feuding, but rather than kill each other, they'd often send mercenary knights to the villages of their enemies to massacre their peasants. Dead peasants were a pain in the butt for a lord who needed their products and taxes, so they got their hired thugs to wipe out an enemy's serfs. The peasants were often in the middle of a rich man's fight back then. Knights weren't always men of honor either, far from it. They were often like the Middle Ages mafia, robbing, extorting, and killing for hire. Chivalry wasn't dead, it was never alive. Not until codes of honor were later invented, in part to stop the knights from slaughtering poor peasants. One historian said this about the typical knight: He's a hired thug. He's got horses, he's got armor, he's like a heavy tank. A noble would hire him and tell him to go over to the land of another noble, burn everything in sight, and kill every last peasant. In one of the chronicles, it's written that some English knights went over to Wales and took 1,000 kids as slaves. Your average peasant didn't have weapons that could do much against men in armor. Galloping at them on horses while wielding longswords, these peasants weren't generally trained in the art of warfare, and their sticks couldn't do much against knights that had experience in killing in the Crusades. In 1379, Sir John Arundel and his men rode into a convent full of nuns. The chronicle says they attacked married women and widows and carted off the kidnapped nuns to their ship along with their bounty. It says it's not easy to describe the shouting or the great sorrow, the lamentation and the floods of tears at the time amongst the women who had boarded the ships. They should have been scared because when a storm threatened the ship, the men threw the 60 nuns over the side, as the chronicle says, to be eaten by the fish and the sea monsters. These were terrible men who never thought twice about exploiting their power against the most vulnerable people. Knights had to be paid, of course. There was something called the knight's service, which consisted of a knight being given some land as long as he promised to serve his overlord in times of war or conflict. Knights sometimes charged a knight's fee, which could also be land or resources such as rivers or mines. Sure, they ran the risk of annoying a high noble or a king, such as when some knights got on the wrong side of Philip the Fair in France. Now, that's an ironic name if there ever was one, at least in light of what we're about to tell you. Philip was one of the people that prosecuted the Knights Templar, the monastic military order that got too big for its boots and had way too much money in some people's eyes. He burned their feet over flames, making them confess to corruption and devil worship, and then burned them at the stake. In 1314, he accused 2 knights of sleeping with 2 of his daughters, saying they committed adultery in one of the guard towers around the city walls of Paris. They were almost certainly framed, but after torture they admitted to the affairs and were charged with lèse-majesté. The women just had their heads shaved and were locked up in a prison, but the men were castrated, flayed, or some accounts say broken on the wheel. The Dark Ages were all about power, and the knights, while often the slaughterers of peasants, were always at risk themselves. There was no safe place in this hierarchy of madness, not even at the top. Philip's son, Louis X of France, the next king of France and one of the early adopters of tennis, was possibly poisoned. Kings were always at risk, just as peasants and knights and clerics were. If life wasn't hard enough for the peasants, disease was rampant. In the villages, there weren't any sewage systems. Usually peasants would either go for their poops out in the field, or they'd fill up a chamber pot and then dump the contents in a hole they'd dug. In the towns, where there were more people, this could create quite a stink, even though there were rudimentary sewage systems such as underground channels. Rats were everywhere, which is why the worst pandemic in human history happened from 1346 to 1353. That was the Black Death, when the bubonic plague killed 75 to 200 million people from Western Eurasia to North Africa, about half the total population of Eurasia. In London, there was the return of the plague in 1360 and 1363, killing about 20% of the population. In 1369, another bout of plague took out 10 to 15% of Londoners. Imagine if you had to deal with all this, plus a bad harvest or two, and then one day someone told you that you had to go fight in a war because your king had some beef with another king. This kind of thing was par for the course in the Dark Ages. It's not surprising then that some people were into playing murder football and dancing themselves to death. A monarch would issue a writ of military summons, which would be sent out to all the nobles in his country. They usually didn't have to fight, but they'd have to get their serfs on board. The peasants were sometimes told they had no choice but to go, although in some cases the lord or noble might offer rewards for their participation. Again, that depended on their level of serfdom. Either way, these peasants were rarely given much training. They usually had to buy their own sword and shield. They were in fact quite a rabble, although the highly skilled knights would have mercenaries on board, as well as skilled archers and longbowmen to supplement the troops. In England, it was seen as everyone's duty to serve for at least 40 days, but that was obviously insufficient when campaigns went on for a while. This is why England started to train a professional army. These men fought in the 100 Years' War with France, which started in 1337. The question is, how did the king even know who was available to fight? It's not like he had the internet or could phone someone for information about his subjects. As we told you, the Normans conquered England. When they did, William the Conqueror became the king. William set about getting rid of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy. He wanted castles built all over England. He had the Tower of London built. He wanted his knights to have armies ready. Then in 1085, he ordered his men to find out who owned land and how many peasants were on each bit of land. Taxing people was made much easier this way, as was amassing armies. This became the Doomsday Book we've mentioned. The 13,000 records in the book show us that most people lived in small towns and villages. London was the largest place with a population of just 10,000. Winchester was the second largest with only 6,000 people, but these towns were big enough for life to get chaotic from time to time, so there had to be some kind of law and order. There were no police, so when every male reached the age of 12, he had to join something called a tithing. A tithe translates as 1/10, which was the amount everyone was supposed to give to the church. The age of 12 back then was the age a person was considered a grown-up. Remember, most folks died young, so at 12, you were a man or woman of the world. All 10 men in the tithing agreed to a system called a frank pledge, which said that if any one of the men breaks the law, it's up to the other guys in the group to make things right. Everyone was their brother's keeper. The women plus the clergy and the more well-off freemen were not part of this system. The lords, of course, and the knights and the clergy were a law unto themselves much of the time. If someone was a victim of a crime, they were supposed to raise the hue and cry, which meant to sound the alarm. It was the responsibility of the rest of the villagers to go after the person. If they didn't, they might look guilty. Often the person was caught and handed some rough justice, a severe beating by the mob, or a swift execution. There were criminal trials, though not just the kind most of us today would think are very fair. Starting in the early 1000s under King Canute, there was a law that said men of good repute were able to clear their names just by swearing an oath. I swear to God I didn't cut off that man's head and throw it to my pigs. Okay, he must be innocent because he said he was. That's how it went sometimes. Other people of a certain repute could get 10 people to swear to their good name. These people were called compurgators. And if indeed the 10 said this guy was innocent, he was innocent. If the alleged criminal could not tick those boxes, he or she often had a trial by ordeal. There was the ordeal by fire. The person had to hold an iron bar that was glowing red after being pulled out of a fire. They had to keep hold until their skin was burnt. After that, their wounds were bandaged. If 3 days later the bandages were removed, the wounds had healed, the person was proven to be innocent. God had obviously intervened and saved them. That, or either they were young and had great natural healing propensity, or their iron bar had not been heated up enough. Either way, if their hands were blistered or infected, they often lost their head or were hanged. There was also ordeal by water, in which the accused was thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they drowned, they were innocent. A rope was attached to them, and if it sank below a certain depth, that meant they hadn't floated, and so they were dragged out. As for the floaters, well, the devil was obviously working in his mysterious ways. This happened to a guy named Aylward after his neighbor Fulk caught him stealing from his house. He floated after being thrown into the local pond. Guilty. He then had both his eyes gouged out and his genitals mutilated. This was only for simple theft. But the best one was trial by combat, so at least the person had a fighting chance of rescuing an innocent verdict. Still, in 1215, King Henry III said these ordeals were rather backward, especially as one priest always oversaw them. The king said that's just not right, so he introduced a jury system, the system England has today. It was quite normal for the person who'd been executed to be put in a cage that was hung high up where people were often congregated. The cage was called a gibbet. The rotting mess inside it was there for the children and the adults to see every day. It was a warning to the local population of what would happen if they broke the law. Throughout English history, there have been records of complaints from people saying the gibbet was too close to their houses. It wasn't a nice sight and it smelled awful. What's strange is if you look at the data from back then, something doesn't make sense. For instance, in 1202, in the city of Lincoln in England, there were 114 murders, but that year there were just 2 executions. On top of that, records show there were 89 robberies with violence and 65 people were wounded during fights in the streets and pubs. So why so few executions? We think you'll be able to figure it out as we go along. If you indeed did get executed, the best thing you could hope for was something fast. A thief might only be beheaded, which is nothing when you consider all over Europe for centuries people were broken on the wheel. This consisted of tying someone to a wheel and literally smashing their bones to pieces with a cudgel, sometimes making the punishment go on for as long as possible by avoiding the head. Usually, though, people were hanged, or at least in London that was the case. The records show in 1396, Thomas Hines stole from someone in London and was hanged. In 1329, a guy named John in Croydon took someone's horse, and he was also hanged. And as you know, if age 12 was considered an adult, then plenty of young folks were executed for small crimes. Back then, boys and girls as young as 7 could end up swinging from the rope. In 1212, King John kidnapped 32 Welsh boys, all sons of nobles. John then had them imprisoned in Nottingham Castle, and then for some reason one day he took each one up to the rampart and hanged them one by one. Contemporary text about this states the boys being taken from their play, some screaming, others pleading in vain for mercy, and hanged on the castle walls. The chronicle notes that their screams could be heard far in the distance. 1212 was a bad year for youngsters. The chronicle states a boy not yet 7 was executed in the town of Shrewsbury. His name was Rhys ap Maelgwn. The stories go on. Girls were burned at the stake and infants had their brains dashed because they might one day make a claim to the throne. A research paper noted courts imposed the death penalty more and more often, and by the late Middle Ages were condemning to death between 0.5% and 1% of all men of each generation, with perhaps just as many offenders dying at the scene of the crime or in prison while awaiting trial. The paper states most people were executed by hanging, but there were also deaths by drawing and quartering, breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake. Perhaps the most shocking are the cases where the murderer was burned alive under the casket of the person they killed. 1 or 2 out of every 100 men would die by execution at one point in the Dark Ages. The murder rate during this period was through the roof. A study undertaken tells us in the 1340s in England, the murder rate in Oxford was a massive 110 per 100,000 people. Many towns in England had murder rates close to this. These days, the murder rate in England is about 1.1 per 100,000. Even with all those gangland stabbings the kids can't seem to get enough of. The USA's murder rate is about 6.5 per 100,000, Mexico's about 28.3, and Honduras is 36.3. Sure, there weren't many people in the 1300s in England, but there sure were many people that would slit your throat over an exchange of glances. In the towns, day-to-day life was an obstacle course covered with bloody daggers. In most of Western Europe in the late Dark Ages, the homicide rate was 23 to 56 per 100,000 individuals. From 1300 to 1348, the most common crime was theft at 73.5% of all crimes. Murder comprised 18.2% of all crimes, receiving stolen goods 6.2%, and other crimes including arson, assault, treason, and counterfeiting coins 2.1%. All of these, of course, were punishable by death. One of the reasons for all these murders was that people didn't go anywhere without a knife. That's why folks could get stabbed playing football. We guess it was indeed possible to accidentally run into someone's knife, just as the chronicle said. If people ate outside in a tavern, they'd always use their own knives. It's not polite these days to eat with a knife. That's because peasants used to do it. We stopped eating with knives as part of our so-called civilizing process. Courtesy books started teaching people manners in the 12th century, and while most peasants couldn't read, the rules about good manners could be passed on verbally. One book tells people speak nicely to any you see and walk slowly and demurely. Don't run off and throw stones or sticks or wrestle with dogs. It talks about table manners, stating don't touch your face or head while you're eating and keep your knife away from your face. Don't loosen your belt sitting at the table, for that is most uncourteous. Don't burp or fart. A lot of the book tells people to be polite to strangers. There was good reason for this. The past was a place of honor, so even slight insults could lead to men defending their honor by using extreme violence. It's said that in 1350, 26% of male nobles died by murder. From 1300 to 1400, an aristocrat's life expectancy was better than a poor person's, but at 45.4, it wasn't very good either. Many people died protecting their honor. Still, if they got to 21, their chances of reaching an older age were greatly increased. We can get a clearer idea of what life was like thanks to more of those rules that started to surface back then. Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, says one rule was don't foul the staircase, corridors, closets, or wall hangings with urine and other filth. That tells you a lot about people back then. Another was don't pee in front of women and don't pee out the window. A strange one was don't greet someone while they're urinating or defecating. People did that in the streets, of course. As strangers often shared beds back then, another rule was to not pull anything out from under the bedsheet if something stinks in there. A small loss of face could lead to extreme violence, so it was better to not embarrass anyone. If he poops in your shared bed, just leave the poop alone. Great advice that we're sure you'll follow one day. Joking aside, people back then really did kill each other over nothing. We found a written account from the 1300s featuring a parish chaplain named William of Wellington. He'd gone to the house of John Cobbler. Now, if you think these names are weird, in England back then, surnames really weren't a thing. So you might get called William, that guy from Wellington, or you might get called the name of your job. So John was the cobbler. Today you see many names like this, such as Smith for the blacksmith, a butcher was a butcher, a Fletcher, an arrow maker. People who looked after animals might be called herd. Back to the account, it said on the 5th day of King Edward, The parish chaplain of Yelvertoft sent his clerk around to John Cobbler's house to buy a candle, the text states. John would not send it to him without the money, wherefore William became enraged, and knocking in the door upon him, he struck John in the front of the head so that his brains flowed forth, and he died forthwith. And this was a man of the cloth whose honor was only slightly affected. That was not unusual. An academic journal writing about towns during this period said people regularly cut off other people's noses when they lost face over debates or over money. All over medieval Europe was this crazy violence, often over matters that today we'd call trifling. We've talked about England today, but Belgium, Scandinavia, Italy, Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands all had these insane murder rates at the end of the Dark Ages. It's hard to know exactly what the cause was, but one research paper seemed to suggest most of the murders were over small matters. Unlike today, where most murders are committed by people who know the victims intimately, stranger-on-stranger murder was the most likely kind of murder back then, or at least people who didn't know the victim very well. The paper added, typically the killing of family members made up less than 10% in medieval societies. In contrast, a large proportion of cases occurred in situations of conflict between primarily male acquaintances, with the offender and the victim often sharing a similar social background or being neighbors in a rural community. The evidence shows a lot of these murders happened in or around taverns, so booze, often the lubricant that makes it easier for people to kill today, was doing the same back then. We think the best booze/murder story in the history of the world happened in Oxford, which you'll remember had the highest murder rate. Those brainy toffs were certainly hot-tempered, as were the peasants that shared the same town. On February 10, 1355, some students at Oxford got a bit too drunk and complained that the ale was not of great quality at the place called Swindlestock Tavern. The tavern owner apparently used stubborn and saucy language, and one of the students threw a drink in his face. A scuffle then ensued between the owner, his buddies, and the students, which quickly turned into a knife fight that progressed into a riot. Cudgels and bows and arrows joined the mass of knives. What started off as a simple bar brawl went on for 3 days. Peasants from the countryside arrived in town, ransacking the students' quarters, often killing the occupants who had nothing to do with the fight. Screams could be heard as rooms were set on fire. A cleric was even scalped. Some 63 people from the university were murdered, as were about 30 peasants. Bodies floated in the river, buried in cesspits, and littered the streets. The scholars that survived had fled, leaving the burning town behind them. The peasants often hated those students, 5,000 of whom had moved into the town of Oxford to study. In fact, one of the reasons the University of Cambridge was established in 1209 was that the locals had lynched 2 scholars in Oxford. Other scholars thought, fudge this, let's start a place in a new town. In the 13th and 14th centuries, such murderous violence was said to be commonplace at these institutions of higher learning. But it wasn't always about envy. Students killed students, scholars killed scholars. In 1314, 39 students at Oxford were murdered when 2 faculties got into a disagreement. If you visit Oxford today, you'll find mostly posh kids hanging around, and despite the odd envious local giving them a hard time, it's a town full of peaceful splendor. So, what does this tell us about the Dark Ages? Maybe there's no better example of the sheer savageness of the times. Earlier, we told you about a town where lots of people committed murder, and yet not many were handed a death sentence. The same happened in Oxford. Barely a person was even arrested. There's an explanation for this. You see, stealing from the rich was the worst thing you could do, just as robbing banks today gets you in a lot of trouble even if no one's hurt. The elites back then protected themselves, so stealing from someone's pond could get you hanged. Killing a noble could get you broken on the wheel, but killing another peasant was sometimes not viewed as a serious crime. Even students killing students was a matter of honor, a fair fight. As a researcher pointed out, homicide was regarded with lenience if it was perceived as the result of passion or occurred in defense of honor. Only the most premeditated cases of murder invariably required the death penalty. Still, it was regarded as acceptable if your neighbor had feuded with you and you stabbed him to death. This is just how things were often sorted out. It sounds more normal when you consider war as a constant feature in people's lives. The peasants had it tough, but in England their lives were made much harder because of the 100 Years' War we mentioned earlier. Those lords and their knights had to provide armies, which meant more taxes for the poor. Story as old as time. After the Black Death in the 1340s, so many peasants had died that they started to think that their labor was worth more money. Instead, they were hit with taxes, and this all kicked off what's called the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. They had had enough. They wanted an end to serfdom, which, as you know, was damn close to slavery. They wanted the king gone too. Then it dawned on them that they were the majority in town. 85 to 90% of the people were of the peasant class. Sometimes only armed with sticks, they went on a rampage, killing on their way, heading toward 14-year-old King Richard II in London. With his forces either on campaigns abroad or up north, he did what any young king would do, and he hid in the Tower of London. The peasants were furious. Even those who weren't unfree serfs had been getting shafted, and if they complained, new laws left them branded with a hot iron or imprisoned. This was labor rights in the 1300s. With uprisings all over England, there was panic amongst the noble classes. Rumors spread that these peasants were going to kill their masters. That's why, under the strict conspiracy laws, people were just hanged because they were accused of getting together and plotting. That's what they did in the end, walking into towns and dragging nobles from their houses, executing them in the street. Now, this wasn't just a matter of murder for honor, it was rebellion. The peasants said they were uninterested in stealing things, as the nobles had accused them of. They shouted, "We're only looking for truth and justice, and we are not thieves and robbers." They eventually met with the king, who was surrounded by 200 knights in full armor. The peasants told him of their demands. Their leader, Wat Tyler, said he just wanted what was fair. He called the king brother and said he meant no harm. He explained the peasants just wanted more rights, something better than starvation, war, and taxes. The king told Tyler the rebels should have all that he could fairly grant. It was a wonderful moment. Cheers rang out amongst the crowd. Justice, at last! But then one of the king's men insulted Tyler, which led to Tyler attacking the Lord Mayor of London. He was stabbed numerous times and died trying to escape on his horse. His body was taken to Smithfield, the place of public executions in London. On the orders of the king, Tyler's head was cut off. It was subsequently paraded around London for all to see, as was customary then and for centuries to come, stuck on a spike on London Bridge. This happened to 5 men, one of whom was a priest whose only crime was saying things such as, "From the beginning all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men." His body parts traveled all over England to remind people of what happens to rebels and supporters of rebels. The message was clear. This is what you get when you mess with us. The death of Wat Tyler pretty much ended the revolt. Those who'd taken part were now in serious trouble. The king, of course, took back all those promises he'd given about reform and justice. Nonetheless, the rebellion was one of the most important events in European history. The peasants had fought back against the elites. This is what nobles all over Europe had feared. The brainwashed masses, with their conditioned love for the king and the church, were not so stupid, and it seemed they did have a limit. Still, the king ordered 4,000 soldiers to travel around England and find the other leaders. Many were executed without trial. From London to Yorkshire, hundreds were killed. Some of the ringleaders were brought back to London to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This consisted of hanging the men, but not until dead, then hacking off his manhood, disemboweling him, relieving him of his head, and severing his limbs from his torso. But something had changed in England, just as things were changing elsewhere in Europe. These rural poor had support from skilled artisans, part of the wealthier communities, holy men, and even some elites. They saw it as a fight for freedom, and indeed the feudal system was viewed as not much better than slavery for many people. The rebellion might not have been a success, but in the bigger scheme of things, its ripples led to significant changes in the years to come. So the Dark Ages were violent. There was little to no justice, people in the street were uncivilized, and the murder rate was sky high. Could it be any worse? Yes, the answer is yes. You could get sick, and we aren't just talking about lepers walking around towns ringing their bells so people knew to stay out of their way. Regular illness was no joke. Being treated was sometimes more hellish than being left to die. One of the reasons it's called the Dark Ages is because, well, in general, a lot of that great work done by the Greeks and Romans was lost in much of Western Europe. The medieval period saw quite a lot of regression, which saw many of the advances made in antiquity being replaced with superstition and outright barbarity. As the Islamic world was conquering parts of Europe, it was also translating Greek and Roman texts, becoming much more advanced than the backwaters like the British Isles. The Dark Ages wasn't as backward as people have made it out to be, but there's no doubt that the Islamic nations from the 8th century to the 13th century had what's called a Golden Age. Science, mathematics, and medicine improved when the Muslims translated the texts of the great powers they defeated. Back in little old England, the Roman roads were decaying, and there was little to no education for the majority of people who, by and large, were illiterate. Meanwhile, the Muslims developed algebra, trigonometry, and geometry. The great antiquity scientists and astronomers were translated into Arabic. Medical men, after reading the works of Greek and Roman physicians, thought about what we now call a nervous system. They applied this knowledge and improved upon it. The Muslims built hospitals and developed pharmacology. They conducted surgeries unknown in Western Europe. They were doing this as the Christians embraced faith healing and miracles over expert surgery. As they had their golden age, peasants in England and the rest of Europe relied mostly on herbal remedies for sicknesses. The leading cause of death included the plague, but also tuberculosis and simple infections. They had few answers to this. Lack of food led to malnutrition and famine, and as you know, warfare and street violence took a lot of people. Records show that the sweating sickness also killed many, which today we call the flu. Dysentery, diphtheria, typhoid, smallpox, and leprosy also took the lives of many in medieval Europe. There was no such thing as madness, or not in the way we think about mental health now. When people's moods were chronically downcast or they became hysterical, it was the devil that was to blame. If available, people were sent to visit holy men for diseases of the mind, who it's said often performed miracles. They didn't, but the fact that this was said denotes how backward these times were. To improve mood, bloodletting was advised, or another form of purging such as being made to throw up. And if that didn't work, a priest might tell someone they needed to whip themselves every night before bed, a process known as self-flagellation. Now and again, the Crusaders would return home victorious with information about the science and medicine of the Islamic world, but this didn't get as far as the villages. A local healer couldn't do much for conditions such as gangrene either. People knew that once that set in, death was on the way unless amputation was performed. If the unfree peasants on the land were lucky, their lord might bring in a doctor to take care of this. Often this loss of a limb would be a flap amputation, which consisted of cutting around the skin in the muscle with a knife and then pulling back the skin so the bone was exposed. Of course, these people had no idea about germs, so sterilizing knives, not a priority. They'd then saw through the bone without any pain relief being administered. To cauterize the wound, they'd often use a hot iron. Death was common. Extreme pain was guaranteed. In towns across parts of Dark Ages Europe, the local hairdresser often performed this bloody operation. They were also the ones who removed your teeth, since even though they were illiterate, they had the tools and experience. These barbers started working sometime in the 10th century, often in local monasteries. They were high in demand during periods of war, which was most of the time. There were also advanced physicians, though, such as Henri de Mondeville, who in the 13th century wrote a book called La Chirurgie, Surgery. He was one of the best around. He studied the works of the Greek physicians we mentioned before, but in France and Italy, where he did his work, peasants certainly weren't his main customer base. In one part of the book, he gives advice on how to remove arrows from the body, a common occurrence in warfare. He said, "As I tried to pull it out through the wound of entry, I failed to recognize that it had small barbs. It was an English arrow which had caught the muscle, and I could neither unhook it nor extract the arrow. I had to make an incision over the point to remove the metal piece." He said when they get one in the neck, there's not much you can do. His exact words were, "Call a priest," just before you pull the arrow out, because the bleeding will kill the guy. If the patient gets worried at the sight of his own blood, his advice is to give him some bread soaked in spiced wine. People who survived surgeries should also be plied with wine. The best there is, he said, and then given healthy food such as pheasants, partridges, meadow birds with narrow beaks, hen's eggs boiled in their shells. He talked about food when he gave advice for brain surgery, saying, "I often have removed bits of the brain which adhered to arrows which I have extracted from wounded heads. Brain tissue resembles soft white cheese." Trepanning was common back then too. If there was bleeding on the brain and pressure, this was the process of drilling into the skull to remove the pressure, or in some cases, remove the demon that had entrenched itself in the person's brain. Have a panic attack? A bout of depression? An epileptic fit? Anything deemed strange? The next thing you know, someone was drilling into your skull trying to find a little devil. Thank God for the Age of Reason, a time of great risk for those people who spoke out against such superstitious nonsense. Rationality made a comeback. But it also wasn't pretty at times. Now you need to watch evil punishments designed to be worse than death, or see how things went wrong in modern times and why Mao Zedong was the most brutal tyrant.